Only 9 people were in the room when it happened. 9 people. And for years, not one of them spoke about it publicly. Not because they were threatened, not because anyone told them to stay quiet, but because what they witnessed that afternoon in the spring of 1967 didn't fit neatly into language. It didn't follow the rules of what a fight was supposed to look like. It didn't end the way fights were supposed to end. A judo black belt, a man who had thrown opponents twice his size across competition mats in 3 different countries, walked into that room with absolute certainty in his chest. He left it staring at the ceiling, and Bruce Lee was still smiling, the exact same smile he'd had since the moment the man walked through the door. That smile, that's the part nobody could explain. Let's go back, all the way back, because to understand what happened in that room, you need to understand who was in it, and why one of those 9 people had already made up his mind that Bruce Lee was about to be embarrassed. His name was Tanaka Hiroshi. That isn't his real name. The people closest to this story still protect it out of respect for his family, but the details of who he was are not fiction. They've been passed down through the tight circle of martial artists who moved through Los Angeles in the mid to late 60s, men who trained together, competed together, argued about technique over bad coffee in cramped dojos. Tanaka was what you would call, in any era, an impressive human being. 6'1", 194 pounds of structured, disciplined muscle. He had started judo at age 7 in Osaka under a coach who had personally trained with students of Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo himself. By the time Tanaka was 19, he had already competed internationally. By 23, he held a 4th-degree black belt. By the time he arrived in Los Angeles in late 1966, he was, by any legitimate measure, one of the most technically gifted judo practitioners on the West Coast. He wasn't arrogant in the way most people picture arrogance. He didn't swagger. He didn't run his mouth. He was worse than that. He was quietly certain. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from genuine accomplishment, and it is far more dangerous than loud bravado because it doesn't leave room for doubt. Tanaka had thrown people, big people, strong people, trained people. He had broken grips that felt like iron. He had taken men off their feet who didn't believe it was possible. He had the calluses, the competition record, and the quiet, settled posture of a man who knew, without needing to announce it, that he could handle himself. When word reached him about Bruce Lee, he listened politely. Then he smiled in a way that said, "I've heard this before." Now, 1967 was a strange and electric time to be Bruce Lee. He had filmed The Green Hornet. He was known. People recognized him on the street in ways that had started to shift the social atmosphere around him, which, for a Chinese-American martial artist in Hollywood in the 1960s, was simultaneously thrilling and complicated. He was teaching. He had students he was deeply committed to, training out of his garage in Culver City, refining what would eventually become Jeet Kune Do with the kind of obsessive, relentless focus that people who knew him personally described as almost frightening. He was 135 pounds, and that number, that one number, was the thing that men like Tanaka always came back to. 135 pounds, 5'7". That's Bruce Lee. You have to understand how that landed in martial arts circles at the time. The culture of fighting, even in the 60s, was built around a foundational assumption. Size translates to power, and power is what wins. Judo, in particular, is a system that has deep respect for weight and leverage. The physics of a throw depend on the relationship between bodies. A bigger body, properly trained, creates more force. That's not an opinion, that's mechanics. And Tanaka knew the mechanics. So when mutual acquaintances brought up a potential meeting, not a formal competition, just an introduction, a conversation, maybe some light sparring, Tanaka agreed with the kind of relaxed willingness that told everyone in the room he considered this a foregone conclusion. He'd seen small, fast men before. He'd thrown them too. The meeting was arranged through a man named Robert, a kinesiology student at UCLA who trained at a dojo in Santa Monica and moved comfortably between several martial arts communities in the city. Robert had seen both men train separately. He'd watched Tanaka work on the mats.
He'd stood in Bruce Lee's garage and seen things that made the hair on his arms stand up. He knew what was coming, but he couldn't say it out loud because nobody would have believed him. The location was a private training space, a converted garage space in a commercial building near Crenshaw, used informally by a rotating group of martial artists for demonstrations, practice sessions, and the occasional conversation that, behind closed doors, got more serious than that. Wooden floors, high ceilings, a heavy bag in one corner, mirrors on one wall. 9 people: Robert, Tanaka, Bruce Lee, and 6 others. A mix of students, instructors, and people connected enough to the community to be trusted with what might happen. Bruce Lee arrived first. He was wearing simple dark training clothes. He stood near the heavy bag, one hand resting lightly against it, and he was talking quietly with Robert when Tanaka came through the door with 2 of his own students flanking him. The room shifted. That invisible atmospheric thing that happens when 2 serious people enter each other's orbit. Tanaka's students were large. Tanaka himself filled the doorframe in a way that was impossible to ignore. Not threatening exactly, but present, physical. The kind of man who, even standing still, occupies space differently than most people. His eyes went immediately to Bruce Lee. And here is the detail that every single person in that room remembered independently, years later, when they finally started talking about it. Bruce Lee was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a performance. A small, quiet, utterly relaxed smile, like a man who had just been told a joke he already knew the punchline to. Like a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been before, even though he hadn't. Tanaka noticed the smile. It confused him, and confusion, in a man of Tanaka's psychological makeup, quickly converted into something sharper. They exchanged introductions, formal, polite. Bruce Lee bowed with genuine respect. He always did, regardless of the situation. He asked questions about Tanaka's background, listened carefully, nodded. He was, by every account, completely present and completely at ease, which was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. Tanaka's students were watching Bruce Lee's arms, his frame, running the mental calculus that trained fighters always run: weight, reach, stance, center of gravity. They were not trying to be rude. It was simply what they knew how to do. And the numbers kept coming back the same. He's small. Fast, maybe, but small. Robert stood near the wall and said nothing. He'd already done this math. He knew the answer was wrong. The conversation moved the way these conversations always did, toward philosophy. Bruce Lee talked about water, about formlessness, about the idea that a system that was too rigid became its own limitation. Tanaka listened with the patient, slightly superior attention of a man who has heard many theories and trusts only what he has proven on a mat. At some point, and the exact sequence of words varies depending on who tells it, Tanaka made a comment, careful, measured but unmistakable in its direction, something about the difference between philosophy and physical reality, about how principles were elegant until someone got their lapel grabbed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room tightened, and Bruce Lee's smile got, if anything, slightly wider. He said, "Show me." 2 words, the simplest possible invitation.
What happened next took less than 12 seconds, but let's slow it down, because those 12 seconds contained more information about the nature of martial ability than most people absorbed in years of training. Tanaka set his feet. The stance was automatic, ingrained, the posture of 10,000 hours of practice. His hands came up in the loose, gripping readiness of a judo practitioner setting for contact. His eyes locked onto Bruce Lee's center line. He was calm, controlled. He had done this 1,000 times against opponents who were bigger than the man in front of him. He began to move forward, measured, a step and a half, looking for the angle, looking for the grip, thinking about the throw. Bruce Lee didn't step back. He didn't brace either. He didn't lower his stance or widen his feet the way someone bracing for contact normally would. He simply stood, still as a photograph, and watched Tanaka come. One of the observers said later that there was a moment, right before it happened, where he thought Bruce Lee had simply decided not to move, had given up the position. had frozen. He had not frozen. He was reading. This is the part that the people who actually understand what happened find most extraordinary. Not the physical outcome. The outcome was, in retrospect, almost predictable to anyone who truly understood what Bruce Lee had developed by 1967. What was extraordinary was the patience, the absolute liquid stillness of a man watching an opponent approach, absorbing every micro-signal, the angle of the shoulder, the shift of weight, the direction of the eyes, and simply waiting for the moment that was already inevitable. Tanaka reached for the lapel grip. He never made contact. Not because Bruce Lee blocked him, not because he parried or redirected or used any of the defensive vocabulary that Tanaka's body was already prepared to counter. Bruce Lee wasn't there. The movement was... Witnesses later struggled to find the word. The closest Robert ever got was this. It was like watching someone step out of a photograph. One frame he was in one place, the next frame, the frame was empty. The strike, the moment. 3 seconds. That's how long the initial exchange lasted before Tanaka understood that the rules of his experience did not apply here. In the first second, his grip found air. In the second second, he registered, distantly, the way the brain processes the impossible slowly, that there was pressure on his right wrist. Not a grip, a contact, a point of connection so precise and so controlled that his arm was already moving in a direction he hadn't chosen before he'd fully understood that it was moving. In the third second, his center of gravity shifted. Not dramatically, not the falling, throwing feeling he knew from competition. Something quieter and more absolute than that. A redirection. A single economical application of force at a point where his body had, without realizing it, become momentarily unable to compensate. He staggered. One step. That was all it took. And in the space created by that one step, Bruce Lee moved again. The strike was a single punch, controlled, stopped an inch from the sternum, the way a man demonstrates precision rather than destruction. But everyone in the room felt it, the displacement of air, the speed, the sound of the movement itself, which was not the sound of effort, but the sound of something mechanical and perfect firing at full capacity. Tanaka froze. Not from the impact, the punch hadn't landed with force, but from information. His nervous system had just received information that contradicted everything his experience had told him was physically possible for a man of this size. The punch had arrived before he'd seen it leave. He hadn't seen it leave. He had only seen it stopped, an inch from his chest, fingers extended, Bruce Lee's eyes completely calm, still smiling.
Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. One of Tanaka's students shifted his weight and immediately stopped, aware of how the movement would read in this room. Tanaka looked down at where the punch had been, then back up at Bruce Lee's face. Bruce Lee slowly lowered his hand, said nothing, waited, and Tanaka, who was not a foolish man, who was not a poor sport, who had the genuine dignity of someone who had earned his skill through suffering and discipline, Tanaka nodded, once, slowly. The room exhaled. That was the moment. 12 seconds, give or take. No dramatic finish, no one on the floor, no blood, nothing that would have looked to an outside observer like much of anything at all. But the 9 people in that room understood what they had seen. They understood it the way you understand a magic trick once the secret is revealed. Not with wonder, but with something closer to awe, because the secret turned out to be harder than the illusion. The secret was years, decades, an almost inhuman dedication to the perfection of movement itself. Tanaka was not embarrassed. He was changed. He asked Bruce Lee one question before he left. He asked, "How long?" Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that Robert, who was standing close enough to hear, has never stopped thinking about. He said, "Long enough to stop being afraid of it."
The 9 people in that room walked out into the Los Angeles afternoon and went their separate ways. No photographs, no recording, no formal documentation of any kind. Just 9 people carrying something in their chests that didn't have a clean name yet. Robert drove home along Crenshaw in silence, both hands on the wheel of his car, the radio off. He later said he didn't trust himself to concentrate on anything else. His mind kept returning to the same image, looping back to it the way the mind returns to something it hasn't fully processed. Bruce Lee standing still while Tanaka moved toward him, and then the stillness remaining while everything else changed. He thought about it for days. He's still thinking about it. In the days that followed, the story began to move. Not publicly, not in newspapers, not in the martial arts magazines that were starting to appear on newsstands in California, the ones that were beginning to document the slow collision of Eastern and Western fighting philosophies happening in American cities. Nothing like that. It moved the way true things move in closed communities, quietly, person to person, in the corners of dojos, in parking lots after training sessions, in phone calls between people who trained together and trusted each other enough to say, "You're not going to believe what I heard." The story changed slightly with each telling. That's the nature of stories. Some versions had the confrontation lasting longer. Some versions had Tanaka on the floor, which wasn't what happened. He'd staggered, yes, but he'd caught himself, and Bruce Lee had never intended anything beyond the demonstration. Some versions added an audience of 20. Some said it happened at a different location entirely. But the core of it, the core never changed. Bruce Lee didn't move until the last possible moment. He moved once, and the outcome was determined before Tanaka's body had fully understood it had happened. That part stayed consistent across every version, because that part was true. The interior of a different dojo, somewhere in Santa Monica, evening. Man in training clothes, talking quietly, not training. Tanaka himself said nothing publicly. This is perhaps the most telling detail of the entire story. A man of his accomplishment and standing could have chosen to tell his own version, could have contextualized it, explained it, rationalized it in any number of ways that competitive pride has available to it. He had options. He was not without standing in the community. He said nothing. His two students said nothing for a long time either. When one of them finally did speak about it, years later, to a writer compiling an oral history of the Los Angeles martial arts scene in the 60s, he used one word to describe watching it happen. He said, "surgical." Then he paused and added, "like watching someone take a clock apart with one hand while having a conversation about something else." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to.
Who Bruce Lee was by 1967. To understand what Tanaka encountered in that training room, you have to understand what Bruce Lee had become by 1967. Not the icon, not the legend, not the posters and the films and the philosophical quotes printed on t-shirts sold in airport gift shops decades later. The practitioner. By 1967, Bruce Lee had been training with a ferocity that people who knew him personally described, consistently and without exaggeration, as almost alarming. He was waking before dawn. He was running. He was skipping rope until his legs gave out, and then he kept going. He was studying anatomy, actual anatomy, the mechanics of the human body, how joints move, where load-bearing structures are most vulnerable, how the nervous system processes impact. He was reading physics. He was applying it. He had begun to discard. This is the part that most people who study martial arts find hardest to understand about what Bruce Lee was doing in the mid-60s. He wasn't adding. He wasn't collecting techniques the way a student collects stamps. He was doing the opposite. He was looking at everything he knew, everything he'd been taught, everything Wing Chun and fencing and Western boxing and Western wrestling had given him, and he was asking one ruthless question: does this work? Not in theory, not in a controlled environment against a cooperative partner. In reality, does this work? If the answer was no, it left. He didn't preserve it out of sentiment or tradition or respect for whoever had taught it to him. It left. What remained was something that had no clean name yet. He would eventually call it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But in 1967, it was still forming, still being tested, still being refined in the converted garage in Culver City and in rooms like the one Tanaka walked into. Every encounter was a laboratory. Every person who walked through the door, whether as a student, a visitor, a doubter, or a challenger, was data. Extraordinarily useful data, as it turned out. The thing about the smile. People kept coming back to the smile. In the years after, when the 9 witnesses began to talk carefully, selectively, and always with a certain reverence, the smile was the element that stayed with everyone most. More than the speed, more than the precision of the stopped punch, more than the way Tanaka's grip found nothing but air. The smile. Because the smile wasn't arrogance. Everyone who was in that room is clear on this point. Arrogance would have been readable. It would have had an edge to it, a sharpness, a quality of wanting to be seen. What Bruce Lee's smile contained was something different and harder to name. The closest Robert ever got to describing it was this. It was the smile of someone who already knew the conversation was about something other than what everyone else thought it was about. Tanaka came into that room thinking the conversation was about size versus speed, about judo versus kung fu, about which system was superior, which man was better, which philosophy held up when it met physical reality. Bruce Lee wasn't having that conversation at all. He was having a conversation about attention, about what happens when a man stops fighting what's in front of him and starts reading what's in front of him, about the difference between reacting and responding, about the space between someone else's decision and their body's execution of that decision, the gap that most people never see and Bruce Lee had spent years learning to live in. The smile was because he was having a completely different conversation, and he found it, not unkindly, a little funny that anyone thought the other conversation was the one that mattered.
Here is the detail that separates this story from a simple anecdote about Bruce Lee being fast. 3 weeks after the encounter in the Crenshaw training space, Tanaka came back, not to challenge, not to re-establish anything, not with his students flanking him. Alone. He came to ask questions. He and Bruce Lee talked for 2 hours that evening about interception, about the economy of movement, about what it meant to train for reality rather than for the rules of a particular system. The conversation was, by multiple accounts, remarkable. 2 serious practitioners meeting at the edge of their own understanding and looking outward together rather than across at each other. Tanaka never formally trained with Bruce Lee, but he came back twice more in the months that followed, and those who knew him said that after those conversations, something in how he approached judo shifted, became less reliant on the certainty of the technique itself, and more interested in the space before the technique, the reading, the moment of decision. He never acknowledged publicly that any of this came from Bruce Lee. He didn't need to. The people who knew him could see it. 12 seconds. Let's stay with that number for a moment because it matters. In 12 seconds, Tanaka Hiroshi, a 4th-degree judo black belt, an internationally experienced competitor, a man who had physically dominated people significantly larger than Bruce Lee, could not complete a single technique against a man 135 pounds. Not because Bruce Lee was stronger. He wasn't. Not because Bruce Lee's system was inherently superior to judo as a discipline. Bruce Lee would have rejected that framing entirely. He had deep respect for judo. He understood its physics. He understood why it worked. But he also understood something that competitive systems sometimes lose sight of. A technique that depends on the cooperation of the environment, the right surface, the right grip, the right timing gap, has a weakness built into it. The weakness is the assumption that the environment will cooperate. What Bruce Lee had developed across years of brutal, obsessive refinement was a way of being that did not make assumptions, a way of moving through the world of combat that kept all options open until the last possible fraction of a second, and then committed with totality. He wasn't guessing what Tanaka would do, he was watching, and the watching happened faster than Tanaka's doing. That gap, that impossible, paper-thin gap between intention and execution, that's where Bruce Lee lived. And no amount of weight, no number of competition victories, no depth of system mastery could follow him there if he didn't want to be followed.
Here is the detail that separates this story from a simple anecdote about Bruce Lee being fast. 3 weeks after the encounter in the Crenshaw training space, Tanaka came back. Not to challenge, not to re-establish anything, not with his students flanking him, alone. He came to ask questions. He and Bruce Lee talked for 2 hours that evening about interception, about the economy of movement, about what it meant to train for reality rather than for the rules of a particular system. The conversation was, by multiple accounts, remarkable. 2 serious practitioners meeting at the edge of their own understanding and looking outward together rather than across at each other. Tanaka never formally trained with Bruce Lee, but he came back twice more in the months that followed, and those who knew him said that after those conversations, something in how he approached Judo shifted, became less reliant on the certainty of the technique itself and more interested in the space before the technique, the reading, the moment of decision. He never acknowledged publicly that any of this came from Bruce Lee. He didn't need to. The people who knew him could see it. 12 seconds. Let's stay with that number for a moment because it matters. In 12 seconds, Tanaka Hiroshi, a 4th-degree judo black belt, an internationally experienced competitor, a man who had physically dominated people significantly larger than Bruce Lee, could not complete a single technique against a man 135 pounds. Not because Bruce Lee was stronger, he wasn't. Not because Bruce Lee's system was inherently superior to judo as a discipline. Bruce Lee would have rejected that framing entirely. He had deep respect for judo. He understood its physics. He understood why it worked. But he also understood something that competitive systems sometimes lose sight of. A technique that depends on the cooperation of the environment, the right surface, the right grip, the right timing gap, has a weakness built into it. The weakness is the assumption that the environment will cooperate. What Bruce Lee had developed across years of brutal, obsessive refinement was a way of being that did not make assumptions, a way of moving through the world of combat that kept all options open until the last possible fraction of a second, and then committed with totality. He wasn't guessing what Tanaka would do, he was watching, and the watching happened faster than Tanaka's doing. That gap, that impossible, paper-thin gap between intention and execution, that's where Bruce Lee lived. And no amount of weight, no number of competition victories, no depth of system mastery could follow him there if he didn't want to be followed.
Legacy. The philosophy made physical. Bruce Lee said many things about fighting that have been quoted endlessly in the decades since his death. He talked about water. He talked about formlessness. He talked about the style of no style. These ideas have been printed on walls, sampled in films, stitched onto merchandise, turned into motivational content consumed by people who have never trained a day in their lives and used to sell everything from gym memberships to cryptocurrency. But the ideas were not decorative. They were operational. What happened in the Crenshaw training space in 1967 was not a philosophy. It was a philosophy made physical. It was the proof of the work, the demonstration that the ideas weren't ideas at all, but techniques, refined to the point where they no longer looked like techniques, refined to the point where they were simply what happened when Bruce Lee moved. He wasn't showing Tanaka that he was better. He was showing him that the question of who was better was the wrong question entirely. The right question,
The question Bruce Lee had spent his life pursuing was simpler and more radical than any competitive framework could contain. What does a human body become when it is developed without limitation? Not constrained by tradition, not constrained by system, not constrained by the comfortable assumption that the way the thing has always been done is the way the thing must be done. What does it become? He spent his entire life answering that question, not with words, with his body, with the speed of a hand that arrived before anyone saw it leave, with a stillness that was not passivity, but something more active than motion, with a smile that knew something the room didn't know yet. The smile was the answer. The smile was always the answer.